I mean, I like it.
This is the European History Lecture. Can you turn that fan down, please, class? For Tuesday, the 7th of June, 2022. We have class today and tomorrow, and then we are concluded. My hope is to finish the Cold War today and do decolonization tomorrow, that's Wednesday, and do the rise of a united Europe and the counterculture West on Thursday. So the unit exam that you would be taking on everything from the end of World War I will be just made part of your final. So that's stuff should be on the study guide for that. We had gotten to Cuba, or as John F. Kennedy always called it, Cuba. Cuba's an island 90 miles off the coast of Florida, 90 miles away from Miami. And it was taken over by Fidel Castro, who, after the Bay of Pigs invasion, declared himself a communist and a friend of Moscow, who began bankrolling the Cuban Communist Party and its slaughter of anyone who didn't fit into their utopia. For Castro, Cuba was the entrepreneurial heart of Latin America. It was also one of the places that had the best cigars on earth. The communists destroyed all that. Today, if you buy bootlegged Cuban cigars, they stink compared to what they should be because communists don't run plantations well, and they don't care much about farming. Okay. Kennedy makes a terrible impression on Khrushchev as basically a callow pretty boy, somebody not of much substance, not to be taken seriously. And so Khrushchev decides to push. And since Moscow is in range of American Jupiter missiles stationed in Turkey, Khrushchev is going to introduce some intermediate range missiles to Cuba that will put the entire east, actually everywhere from Dallas, Texas to Portland, Maine, in a 15-minute window of attack. The American mainland has never been threatened like this before. Not since the British burned the White House in the War of 1812 has the American mainland come under attack by a foreign power. So this is a shocking proposition. We spot the facilities that are being built to house and launch these missiles with aerial reconnaissance. Kennedy has a decision to make. He's not going to let it happen. He can either invade Cuba, he can launch airstrikes without an invasion, or he can blockade Cuba in what he chooses to call a quarantine. Kennedy is afraid of escalating a war with the Soviets into global thermonuclear war. So he chooses the least intrusive option. Instead of calling it a blockade, which has legal characteristics under international law, he calls it a quarantine, as if Cuba is to be quarantined from outside diseases, quarantined by the United States Navy. The Russians still have cargo ships on their way to Cuba. It'll be an interesting thing to see what happens when the cargo ships reach the American picket line. Meanwhile, reconnaissance flights continue over Cuba, and Kennedy goes on national television to announce that an attack by Cuba on anywhere in the Western Hemisphere will be interpreted as an attack by the Soviet Union upon the United States that will trigger a full and unrestricted response. Everyone I know who was alive and aware when that speech was given know exactly where they were, because they realized that we were this close to full-scale global thermonuclear war. And for days and days, the world waits to see who will blink first. The Americans invade. Will they launch airstrikes? Will they back off? Will the Soviet ships be stopped? Will they be sunk? Will they be turned around? Will they allow themselves to be turned around? Military are on alert all over the world, Soviet and American, NATO and Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact is the Soviet version of NATO. The British quietly arrange a backroom deal between mid-level bureaucrats within the spy and foreign intelligence services of the United States and the Soviet Union. The low-level deal produces a result. Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet premier, sends a message to Kennedy that is somewhat conciliatory and indicates that he will remove the missiles, which is part of the secret deal arranged by the British. The Soviets will withdraw their missiles publicly. Within the year, the Americans will withdraw the Jupiter missiles from Turkey quietly. The Soviets accept this because their navy is weak. Their nuclear forces, while existent, are not as strong as the Americans. They're at a disadvantage, and they're messing in the Western Hemisphere, which is America's backyard. So Khrushchev sends a conciliatory telegram, but then forces within the Kremlin make it clear to little Nikita that this is not acceptable. So about 12 hours later, while the Americans are deliberating their response to Khrushchev's nice message, he sends a much harsher message by telegram. Kennedy, again, comes up with an elegant solution. He will ignore the second telegram entirely, as if it hadn't been sent or received. Instead, he will answer the first telegram with a definite yes. That definite yes is accepted by Khrushchev. Both sides back down. The Soviets withdraw their missiles. The crisis is averted. Within the year, Khrushchev is running a power plant in Siberia. Unlike in the age of Stalin, he's not killed, but he is exiled to a hydroelectric dam where he's going to spend the rest of his life in obscurity. A new guy named Brezhnev will take over. What we didn't know at the time, what we learned after the fall of the Soviets, was that, and I still have difficulty believing this, it doesn't seem right to me, because the Soviets always kept good control over their most important armed forces, even overseas, especially their nuclear forces. But for reasons I do not fathom, apparently the Soviets gave a couple of the intermediate range nuclear missile sites into Cuban control. Cuban control. And it was clear that the Soviets expected that if airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba began, Cuba would have launched nuclear attacks upon major American cities. And that would have triggered the final war. To my knowledge, the Soviets never again lost control of their strategic nuclear forces, not at least until the fall of the Soviet Union. And after the release of tensions from the Cuban Missile Crisis, a hotline was set up between the White House and the Kremlin to allow the leader of the Soviet Union and the leader of the United States to converse by telephone in real time. The thought is that this can prevent misunderstanding and that this could be the solution to the kind of crisis that we just went through. Also, a comprehensive test ban treaty is set up that forbids the testing of nuclear weapons in the open air and the militarization of space with nuclear weapons. So space is off limits for nuclear weapons throughout the rest of the Cold War, and all nuclear testing must be underground. And there's a hotline. Never again will the Soviets and the Americans come that close to a policy-driven nuclear war. In the early 1980s, there's an accident that almost causes a nuclear war through a misunderstanding. There's a NATO military exercise that the Soviets don't perceive as a military exercise. And the Soviets go to DEFCON 2, which is their fingers are on the nuclear trigger, ready to pull, because of a exercise. Had anything gone wrong, had there been any accidental overflight of Soviet territory during this exercise, it's entirely possible that the Soviet Union, which was in the process of going through 3 supreme leaders in 4 years, which makes them unstable, weak, and nervous, might have very well pulled the trigger, and then suddenly, without warning, 50,000 atomic and nuclear weapons would have been launched, and life would have ended. As it is, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides developed mutually assured destruction capability over the other through nuclear triads. The nuclear triad is a 3-way delivery system of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, by the way, are hydrogen bombs. Atomic weapons are fission bombs, like the Hiroshima bomb. Most people use the term nuclear for both kinds. Strategic bombers. Land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles. The most secure of the forms of delivery are from submarines. Even today, tracking a nuclear submarine that is quieter than the water around it is very, very difficult. It really takes another nuclear submarine to do it. So you can't see them from satellites. You can't detect them from space. So we and the Soviets have strong submarine-based missiles. Land-based nuclear weapons are more vulnerable to attack, especially in the United States, because we've dug ours deep into the ground in nuclear missile silos in Montana and Nebraska and the Dakotas. The Soviets have some missile fields, but they also have a number of mobile launch devices on the backs of train cars and trucks. That makes them harder to spot.
My father served on submarine. Time when he talks about the Ohio stuff, those missile submarines, it's just crazy hearing about them because even though they're not attack submarines, even our own attack subs came by the majority of the time when you find an Ohio against the captain, made a really big whoopsie.
Yeah.
Or you just got really lucky with the local weather conditions and stuff.
Now, the Ohio is an amazing ship, and that's the ship I mentioned that is quieter than the water around it. Everything that's a machine is on rubberized pylons so that the vibration of the turbines and the nuclear engine are kept from the outside. Now, they're amazing devices. So with this mutually assured destruction, the Cold War settles down. The opportunity of one side being weak is not there. The Soviets rise to the level of American nuclear forces and then exceed the level of nuclear forces. In the 1970s, the Soviets have a pronounced advantage. Now, during the 1960s, again, in the Eastern Bloc, with the change of leadership from Khrushchev to Brezhnev, in Prague, Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring event occurs, which is a more peaceful version of the Hungarian uprisings, where the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia liberalizes without Moscow's permission. Emre Nagy is the leader of that Communist Party. So it's the leadership of the Soviet colony or satellite state that's trying to liberalize. And for a while, it seems to be succeeding, and then Brezhnev sends in the tanks, and the Prague Spring is crushed bloodily. And the Soviets make clear, we are not going to let you in our satellite states and our colonies liberalize. In French Indochina, a number of things are going to happen. French Indochina is given up by France in the early 1950s after they lose a major war to the Vietnamese communists and nationalists. Rather than let the communists take over the country, the United States backs a plan to abandon national elections and instead installs a Vietnamese Catholic in power in South Vietnam, and the communists get North Vietnam. But the North Vietnamese communists are absolutely not satisfied with this. They learned how to fight a major army from the Americans in World War II when we taught them how to fight the Japanese. They used those lessons to drive the French out. They're going to use those lessons again against us with the help of the Soviets and the Chinese. In a 10-year war in Vietnam, the Americans get involved to try to protect South Vietnam, but at no time is the invasion of North Vietnam contemplated. The Vietnamese violate the territory of neighboring nations Laos and Cambodia. We'll bomb them, but we don't really want to invade them. So we're on defense. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army can attack at will anywhere they want. The war is an example of being power blind and of the ruin that can come from underestimating your opponents. The Americans did not take the war seriously. The strategists and politicians who ran the war believed that they could apply psychological techniques like proportional response, as if you're trying to train a dog or a baby not to go to the bathroom on the living room rug. These were committed nationalists, communists, and experienced guerrilla fighters. They were not children and animals learning how not to go to the bathroom. So instead of adapting themselves to avoid getting spanked by Uncle Sam, they learned how we fought. They would do things to provoke a proportional response, and they would observe how we functioned and find weaknesses in that. In 10 years of war, we lose over 50,000 dead, about the same as in Korea. Smaller battles, lower death rate per year, but longer war. And ultimately, unlike Korea, they killed enough Americans and we went away. In 1973, the United States pulls out of Vietnam thanks to the anti-war movement in the United States. And 2 years later, the communists take over, and over 1 million South Vietnamese are murdered within the next couple of years because they were stupid enough to trust that the United States would not let them wither and die under communist rule. Much the same thing that our current president has allowed to happen in Afghanistan since last summer. No, that's not a cheap shot. Even Democrats admit that what happened in Afghanistan was not good last August. In any event, the Vietnam War is a touchstone for another event which deserves a lot more time, and that is the development of counterculture in the West. The culture that we are steeped in, involving sexual liberation and questioning gender and women's liberation, the legalization of homosexuality, the toleration of drugs, the allowance of gay marriage, the de-emphasis of Christian values, the de-emphasis of Jewish traditions, the de-emphasis of any traditions, the greater tolerance towards socialism or social democracy, rock and roll music, drugs. All of this comes onto the stage with the baby boom generation when they were young in the 1960s and 70s as a protest against the squares that brought us to war in Vietnam. Counterculture has, since that time, become much more mainstream, to the point where around the world today, international business operates under banking laws that are called, social, economic, government. So I'm doing that wrong. Basically, if companies foster what they call social justice agendas and encourage governments to get involved in the social justice battles and do so in the name of the environment, then international banks will be friendly to your investments. If you do not, if you adhere to more traditional values, international banks will actually punish you. This is a major reason why so much has become political in entertainment, in movies, in television shows, in computer games, because the ideas of equity and representation are part of social justice, environment, governance, which is this new philosophy. This is a product of counterculture. It's intended to replace the traditional Western civilization that I've tried teaching you about with something unprecedented, not oriented towards Judeo-Christian values, not oriented towards liberal democracy, which is American freedom, but oriented towards a much more communitarian outlook, where you are not just alone making decisions for yourself, but instead you are part of a community, and the community gets veto power over your freedom. This is what the Canadians are trying under Trudeau. This is what the Western Europeans have been trying for the last 40 or 50 years under social welfare states. It is a major change in the West. And I am talking to you about it in just a few minutes because I screwed up and was about a month behind where I should be. This is something you know about because you live in today's culture. You have seen people get canceled. You have seen this woke agenda. Well, it's first experimented with large scale as a reaction against the Vietnam War. And the West has been transformed by it, whether the West will fight back and retain its traditions, or whether it will completely go under and be replaced by this new secular humanist society. That's an open question. That's what a lot of the political battles of this moment are about. Before I go on, I know I'm going super fast. Do you have any questions, comments, or thoughts? Yeah.
So in relation to this change in society, how do you think that it has moved from generations? So like that generation, like my great uncle, he was a veteran in the Vietnam War. How has that kind of progressed?
I'll tell you. What most liberals of that era talked about is freedom of speech, freedom of lifestyle. Almost what a libertarian or an anarchist would talk about today. To try to break up the traditional notions of right and wrong that Judeo-Christian values that evolved. Today, that's not the case. Today, many people on the left want to enforce their ideas by punishing anyone who disagrees. It's the opposite of what free speech and the free speech movement was in the 1960s. In those days, liberals talked about freeing people from the constraint of conformity and censorship. Today, it is liberals, on the vast majority of the time, that are engaged in censorship and the punishment of people who think thought crimes. Another difference is that when the Civil Rights Law of 1964 was passed, what it was that middle-class America was inviting anyone who was black to join us. And when Martin Luther King talked about judging people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, he was talking about inviting people into the American middle class. Today, on the left, as I see it, the American middle class is demonized as white supremacist, white privilege, irredeemably capitalist, and must be destroyed. I don't know what they intend to replace it with, but it's not going to be a place where you can earn a living by being clever and coming up with new ideas. It's going to be a place where everything you do or say is going to be put under a microscope by some ideologue who's going to want to reward or punish you. Like what's going on in China with their social credit system. I am still old-fashioned. What I want is a colorblind meritocracy, which is what liberals used to ask for. I want a society where everyone is judged by the choices that they make, not who they are. And the one thing I didn't say during graduation that I intended to was in life, what I recommend to you above everything is try to be distinguished not on the basis of what you are, because you didn't choose that, but by the basis of what you choose to do. Every one of us can make wise choices. Every one of us can be held accountable for making wise choices. None of us chose to be born male or female. None of us chose to be born with this or that inclination. We didn't choose our parents. If we did, what the hell's wrong with us? What we have, each of us, is a flawed life with opportunities to do great things if we choose to. You can't control what you are. I don't care about your identity. This is the problem I have with identity politics. It pigeonholes everyone into things that they didn't choose. I believe in colorblind meritocracy. The left used to believe in that. Not anymore. At least not mine. Anyway, this is a huge deal, and I don't have time to do it justice. But I assume, being thoughtful people, you're already thinking about these issues. No doubt some of you have very different ideas about it than I do. Good for you. This is America. In the 1970s, as a result of defeat in Vietnam, the West is weak of will, of dedication to the war against the Soviets, the Cold War. And this weakness is exploited upon by several wars of national liberation in the new Third World. The term Third World is the former colonies of Europe that were freed by Europeans in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s. So the former colonies are now independent countries. And what usually happens in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and South Asia is Britain, for example, leaves a society that has a multi-party parliamentary democracy. And within 3 or 4 years, the ruling party eliminates all the parties but its own, eliminates the parliament, and the leader becomes somebody who has total power. This pattern of dictatorship happens all over the Third World. And the communists exploit this to try to encourage anyone who wants to be a dictator to buy Soviet weapons and join the Soviet bloc if they win, or the Chinese. The way the West tries to deal with this seems similar to appeasement. It's called détente. Détente is a French word from archery. When you're pulling back a longbow and don't shoot it, and you slowly reduce the tension in the bow and take your arrow off of it, that act is called détente, the release of tensions. So instead of engaging the Soviets in ongoing proxy wars like Vietnam and wars of assassins, we try using diplomacy to blunt the Soviet attack. And there's a success in this. And I didn't write it down up here, but I will now, and I suggest you to. The Helsinki Accords. Helsinki is the capital of Finland. Helsinki Accords. At Helsinki in 1975, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the other major nations of the world signed a treaty on human rights. That treaty on human rights is going to come back to bite the Soviets hard. Because the old-style crushing of Hungary in 56 and Czechoslovakia in 68 can't work in the 1980s in Poland because the Soviets have agreed to the Helsinki Accords on human rights. And if they violate them openly, the Soviets will lose a lot of their diplomatic and economic power. So, as much as I, a conservative, don't really like détente, there was a really effective moment in it where the Soviets agreed publicly to abide by international standards of human rights, which they, of course, had no intention of following. But in the 1980s, when they were tempted to loose the Red Army on the Poles, they didn't, in part because they were afraid of the backlash to breaking that treaty. Communists advance in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in Cambodia. Jackson did a wonderful presentation on this earlier in the day. Cambodia is part of French Indochina. It's west of Vietnam. It had a population in 1975 of 7.5 million people. Khmer Rouge, the communist Cambodians under a guy named Pol Pot, took over. He believed in returning Cambodia to an agrarian paradise of pre-industrial communitarianism. So he emptied the cities of everyone. Anyone who had teeth-filled eyeglasses, foreign languages, math skills, anyone who had engineering degrees, foreign travel experience, was killed, unless they were already a member of the Khmer Rouge. The only people that were allowed to live were people who farmed and didn't think. And tricks were set up because 14-year-olds with guns were put in charge of these camps. And anyone who varied even the slightest from their orthodoxy was dead. In 1979, the communist Vietnamese saved Cambodia from the Khmer Rouge. By that point, half the country is dead. 3 million out of 7.5 million murdered by the Cambodian Communist Party in 4 years. Not even Mao Zedong killed almost 50% of the Chinese people. In terms of proportion of people murdered, no communist dictator is as successful as Pol Pot during the 75 to 79 period. It is a horror show called The Killing Fields. And there is a wonderful movie with the same title, which is from the perspective of a liberal New York Times American reporter But even with that perspective, it does a good job of showing the horrors of it. And if we had more time, I would show you some scenes right now. My bad, we don't. In late 1970, in the late 1970s, 1978, I told you that Iran was taken over by an American monarch, a pro-American monarch named the Shah. In 1978, he was overthrown by Islamist revolutionaries. In 1979, these Islamist revolutionaries take over the American embassy and hold American embassy staff hostage for 444 days. During that 444-day period, Jimmy Carter, the American president, a liberal Democrat, tried diplomacy, and the Iranians made us look ridiculous. Finally, 6 months in, he authorizes a military rescue of the hostages. But he had systematically cut defense spending for the last 3.5 years. So what happened in Iran was we were supposed to land helicopters and aircraft at an improvised base in the middle of the desert away from everything called Desert One. As it turned out, Desert One was right next to a major Iranian highway. As our planes were landing, an Iranian bus filled with people was captured. What do we do with them? If we let them go, do we hold them? Do we kill them? We're not going to kill them because we're Americans. We're good guys. And as we're nervous about this, as the helicopters are ready to go into Tehran, the capital, and we thought we knew where the hostages were and get them. There's a mid-air collision as helicopters are taking off, and the fireball could be seen for hundreds of miles, lit up the night sky. So we pull out, no hostages are rescued, and we look incompetent. We don't kill the bus, we let the people leave. The next morning, Iranians are dancing around on the burned wreckage of American aircraft. The 1980 presidential election largely is about hyperinflation, like we're beginning to experience now, and the Iran hostage crisis. The Republican running, Ronald Reagan, says publicly, if these barbarians don't let our people go, I will wage war on them that will knock them back to the Stone Age. In other words, Reagan publicly threatens genuine full-scale war. Reagan is elected. On the day Reagan's sworn in, the hour Reagan takes the oath of office, a jetliner filled with the hostages leaves Iranian airspace. Most Americans say, hey, we won. Hey, they released our hostages. Hey, the people who put them in as hostages are still in power, even today. The Iranian government is the heart of international terrorism around the world. And while we hit to their west in Iraq and to their east in Afghanistan, President Bush neglected to hit the Iranians, which he, my judgment, should have done. In any event, they remain an enemy of the West, active. Just listen to them talk. Oh, and they've also talked about it being their holy destiny to purge Israel with cleansing fire of God. And these are people who, for the last 20 years, have been trying to get nuclear weapons. They're the only country on earth whose leadership has consistently talked about the good idea it is to use nuclear weapons. So, in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. We decide to pay the Soviets back for Vietnam. The Soviets caused 50,000 American deaths by arming and supporting the North Vietnamese, so we armed and supported the Holy Warriors of God, the Mujahideen, Islamist terrorists, who fought the Red Army to a standstill. In their war, which lasted 10 years, and our allies inflicted over 50,000 casualties on the Soviet Red Army. And they left Afghanistan in defeat. So we paid them back. On the other hand, some of the allies that we had included Osama bin Laden and the people who would later form Al-Qaeda. To an extent, we fostered the devil that would come after us. But the enemy of your enemy is your ally. And the Soviets were much more dangerous than the Islamic terrorists. Then and now. President Reagan in the early 80s decides to press the Soviet Union by building up America's military. He also begins to build what is called in popular culture the Star Wars missile defense program. Space-based laser weapons, particle beam weapons, anti-rock missile rockets, anti-missile missiles, the Patriot system, all missile defense systems in the modern world come from this. The Soviets cannot compete because their computing technology is generations behind. In 1987, at Iceland, Gorbachev, the new leader of the Soviet Union, tries to convince Ronald Reagan to back off from Star Wars, and in return, he's prepared to give a bunch of concessions, unprecedented concessions from a Soviet leader. Reagan says, no, can't give it up. It's about defending my people against attack. The Star Wars program threatens mutually assured destruction because it creates the impression that America can receive a nuclear attack, destroy the missiles on the way in, and then launch a counterattack with impunity. The Soviets are so nervous about the Star Wars program that they bankrupt their economy. Their economy breaks. It is not unusual in the Soviet Union for women to spend the better part of a day standing in a line to get a loaf of bread. The Soviet economy has stopped producing goods for consumers in a reliable fashion. All it produces is weapons. In 1985, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev is like Khrushchev, a liberalizer. And he pronounces his policies of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost is the openness that people should have with government. If you have a complaint, make it against the Communist Party's government and we'll fix it. We can't fix it if we don't know about it. So for the first time since ever, the Soviet people are encouraged to complain to their government. Perestroika is a restructuring of the Stalinist-era communist system. In the midst of this, 1989 happens. Eastern Europe rises up. There is a hands across the Baltic states movement where people in the name of freedom form an unbroken link across Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. I don't know if you've heard about that. In Czechoslovakia, a playwright that was imprisoned by the communists becomes president. In Poland, a trade union leader that had been damned by the communists, and a member of the industrial proletariat, a shipyard worker, who had been punished by the communists for wanting a free trade union, becomes the president of Poland. The Soviet Empire is falling apart. What I expected was the Soviets to launch a war. Amazingly, Gorbachev didn't. Gorbachev allowed the Soviet Union to fall without starting a war. That was a gift to the world. His reward was he's lived in San Francisco, I think, ever since, as an American with a vast amount of wealth. But he still complains that communism really wasn't given a chance. The Chinese watch the fall of the Soviet Union, and they say, not us, ever, ever. The same year that the Berlin Wall falls, 1989, the Chinese massacre the student pro-democracy demonstrators at Tiananmen Square. So, while Russia becomes a democracy in the early 1990s, China remains a totalitarian police state. It's interesting what happens afterwards. Russia is allowed to wither. This was stupid. The Americans should have had a Marshall Plan for the former Soviet Union, should have invested a lot of money in the former Soviet Union, and should have made damn sure that the money did not go to former Communist Party officials and gangsters. But we didn't. We neglected the victory. For the first time, the Soviets a country loses a war to the United States and doesn't profit from it. Instead, gangsters and former party hacks take over Russia. Its president is an old drunk named Yeltsin, who is at least somebody that we could work with. But in 1999, Yeltsin is overthrown by Putin, who is still in power. We let it happen in the sense that we did not try to help build a genuine, good society in the former Soviet Union. We allowed the elements that had thrived under communism to continue to thrive after communism. The Chinese, on the other hand, were given vast amounts of Western wealth to invest and modernize China. The thought was, if we bring China into the modern world of business, the Chinese Communist Party will wither and die. No. The Chinese Communist Party has turned China from a backwards third world country into a backwards third world country with a few first world cities and a bunch of weapons at least as good as ours, with a military much larger than ours. We tried paying off the Chinese. Honestly, I think we should have invested in Russia. But instead, we invested in China, and the Chinese Communist Party is stronger than ever. Or so it seems. That is my quick and dirty lesson on the Cold War. Tomorrow, I intend to talk about the fall of Europe's empires and move towards the rise of the European Union. And that will conclude, bless you, the course. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Thank you for your attention. You may talk among yourselves.
Okay.